Okay, so popular sovereignty is the first principle that we're going to look at, and it is the idea that the government gets its power from us, that we are the source of the government's power, that power is derived because we give the government that power. So that's Lockean there, in that when you think about the social contract and how it requires the consent of the governed, we somehow consent to be governed. Now, I didn't sign the Constitution and none of you did either, and yet you're in it. So how do we give our consent? Daily, we give that, you could say, just sort of by acquiescing. And symbolically, you can see it in the Constitution in the preamble, which starts, "We the people." But there is a way that we can frequently check in and give the government power, and we do that through elections. So popular sovereignty, that idea, is very closely related to the idea of democracy. Democracy, again, meaning demos, the people, cracy, govern. So we can go out and vote, and if we don't like what our elected officials are doing, we vote them out of office and put someone else in who hopefully will deliver the policies that we would prefer. And even when you don't vote, in some way you're consenting there because you had the opportunity to vote and you said that you were okay with the status quo by not voting. There are other ways to demonstrate popular sovereignty in addition, but these are just the most typical. Popular sovereignty can be demonstrated just by contacting your congressman, writing a letter, sending an email, or organizing demonstrations to show the government that you want a bigger change from your elected officials. So popular sovereignty in this country, the idea that we control the government, we could say it's expanded as more people have been granted the right to vote. And so in addition to elections, making sure that people can legally participate in those elections helps build popular sovereignty in this country. So that's principle number one. The second one we're going to go through will be limited government. Limited government is the idea that the government should be constrained in what it can do, kind of in the name. But part of this is to limit the government so that we are more free. So we restrict government so that certain rights that we have can't be taken away. Freedoms can't be infringed upon by that government. The mere existence of the Constitution limits government. This is a rule book. Who is this a rule book for? It's really not a rule book for we the people. It's a rule book for the government. This tells Congress what it can and cannot do. This tells the president what he or she can or cannot do. So the Constitution, I want to remind you, it's a rule book for the government, not really for us, because our freedoms are essentially potentially unlimited. And we limit the government in order to protect freedom, or in order to protect liberty. So thinking about how freedom and order are often exclusive from one another, or sometimes you hear it as liberty versus security. We want a government that's going to keep us safe, secure, and we're willing to give up some freedoms in order to have that security. But we want to make sure that we're not handing over total power to the government, because if we do that, then our freedoms are threatened. Okay? So that's limited government. The whole document here limits government. Okay? Separation of powers. I don't have the definition here because it's rather obvious from the term. But if you'd like a definition, separation of powers is the separating of legislative, executive, and judicial powers into three branches. So what you see here is a chart. The legislative branch has legislative powers. What legislative powers are to make laws. The executive branch has executive power, which means it has the power to enforce laws. And the judicial branch has the power to interpret the law and to pass judgment. So I put this chart here to demonstrate that you have three branches of government, but remind you there are two governments you live under. So what we call the legislative branch for the federal government, that institution's name is Congress. And the head of the executive branch for the federal government is the president. It's not a one-man show, but we'll get into all the other people in the executive branch much later. And then the judicial branch is composed of many courts, but here I have the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. And then you have pretty much the same structure down here for the state. So the governor is like the president of the state. He enforces the law. Texas State Legislature, bicameral body, structured much like Congress, but we wouldn't give it the name Congress. That name is reserved just for the one in Washington, D.C. And then we have a set of courts here in this state, and then at the top of those courts would be our Supreme Court. One other thing I want to write here for separation of powers is it's also can be thought of as a sharing of powers. So we divide powers, but we take legislative powers, give them to the legislative branch, executive powers give them to the executive branch, judicial powers give them to the judicial branch. But there are instances where we can think about, even though power's been divided, that there is still a sharing of powers, that the three branches don't work totally separately, that they can work together. So for example, when we think about in foreign policy, like war powers, the president is commander-in-chief. He can deploy troops and decide strategy and tactics, but he has to get the money to fund all that. He has to go ask Congress. It's Congress that collects the taxes and has the power of decision making with regards to how that money is spent. So the two branches often work together. They might have different jobs, but they are working together and sharing that power. All right, and the fourth principle is completely related to separation of powers. They're often confused with one another. There is a distinction, but it can be challenging to see. The checks and balances are where the three separate branches overlap. And we have these overlapping, we have them overlap because that then provides for an opportunity for one branch to check in on the other, to limit the other branch, so that those three branches remain independent and co-equal. That overlap is absolutely needed in order to preserve the powers of each. So here you have a basic checks and balances chart. There's a lot more that by the end of the semester you'd be able to add in at least a dozen more things. So right now if you want to pause it and copy it, those are important checks and balances. And so I'll just highlight one. Congress, this is a picture of Capitol Hill, Congress in Washington, D.C. They get to make laws. The president is in charge of the executive branch enforcing laws, but he can step in the legislative process. He does have the option to veto a bill and essentially halt the 535 people over here. And that's important to make sure that, Congress is checked and limited. He in some ways can represent the American people sometimes better than the entire body over here. But we also don't want a president that is obstructing progress, and so Congress also can override one of his vetoes with the 2/3 vote. The Supreme Court down here has kind of a big trump card. It can declare laws or actions unconstitutional. We're going to get to that when we do judicial review at the very end. So copy down this chart, and then I'm going to end this one and pick up principles 5 through 6 on the next video.